we've got Fiona here. She's currently muted. Let me switch up my setup here. Fiona, I see you perfectly. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to flip the stream here so that the people can see you, which will make for a better show. Okay, let's just go here. Boom. Okay, so Fiona, you are unmuted. Are you with me? Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, yes. Hello.
Okay, hello Fiona. Thank you so much for joining. Let me try to make your screen here a little bigger on my end. Because we got actually, you know what? You're good. Charlie, by the way, your video is being shown. Okay, Fiona, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it. Just want to give a quick intro. So as we said at the beginning of the show, Fiona Harvey is she's a journalist. She was environmental journalist. We're going to talk about climate change. She was at the Financial Times for about a decade, and now she's at The Guardian. She's a very prolific writer. We're going to link to her profile on The Guardian. She's churning out a lot of articles. I read through some of them. Fiona, I love the work you're doing. It's awesome how much you're writing, and I love your objective takes you're taking on things. You don't seem to write from the left or the right. You seem to just give it right down, not necessarily the middle, but you're not getting too political in what you're saying. You're just laying it out, which I really appreciate writing like that. So, Fiona, thank you so much for being on here. And how you doing?
Great, thank you. Yes, it's a pleasure to be on.
Okay, awesome. Right on. Okay, so just the first question, and I know I've been thinking this, and we talked about this in the intro of the show, is COVID-19 making you see climate change in a new light? Is it making you think about how the world needs to respond to problems?
Yes, I think that the crisis is making people think very differently about a lot of issues related to climate change. In one way, of course, it's having a very direct impact. We're seeing greenhouse gas emissions falling as a result of the lockdowns in place around the world. Now, that is likely to be a temporary
Right.
effect, but it's interesting to see what's going on there. But we shouldn't confuse that impact with the kind of the long-term structural changes that we need to make to the global economy if we are to bring down greenhouse gases on a permanent basis. This sudden, sharp shock to the economy is not what anyone who wants to see climate change tackled would have wanted. It's not a good thing, and the resulting decline in emissions is an effect, but it's only very temporarily beneficial.
Right.
It will make very, very little difference in terms of climate change, unless we take this opportunity to make a more permanent difference. And that, I think, is the real impact of COVID-19, is that it teaches us to look at our world in a different way. We need to look at what sort of things we value as people, as human beings. And we also need to look at how our economy operates and how our economy could operate, because we've got to come out of lockdown and we have a lot of choices about how we bring the economy back up. We've got choices about where we spend the public money
Right.
that nearly all countries around the world are planning to spend to try to rescue their economies. We have choices about how we change our behavior. Perhaps do we maintain some of the behaviors that have been forced upon us by lockdown and the coronavirus crisis? How do we facilitate those broader behavioral changes around the world? For instance, a lot more people are working from home, doing things remotely, socializing remotely, and
Right.
so on. And doing that is generally a good thing in climate change terms, because it means less flying, less other forms of transport. It can mean, if it's done right, it can mean less greenhouse gas going into the atmosphere. So we might want to try to keep some of those behaviors, perhaps not to the extent that we're doing them now, but to
Sure.
encourage people to continue living like that in some way. More people are cycling and walking, and people are enjoying the lack of air pollution and so on. So we don't want to just go back to a dirty world, and we don't need to.
Right, and I want to touch on something that you talked about. You talking about how the governments are spending money to make up the gap for the lack of for the fact that the economy has been big parts of the economy have been shut down. So you recently wrote about an Oxford University study which compared green stimulus projects to those from the '08 during the global financial crisis, the stimulus projects during that time, and this study found that the green stimulus projects deliver higher short-term returns, and I'm quoting it right now, higher short-term returns per pound spent by the government and lead to an increased long-term cost savings. My question to you, given how quickly the economy tanked, is this something that's feasible when dealing with kind of green stimulus, which is going to be certainly more politicized than just throwing money at everything? Is this something that is feasible in your mind right now, given that the assistance and the jolt to the economy needs to be given right away, instead of spend months deliberating on it? I'm curious how you think we can go forward and hopefully get some more money to some of these green projects. But do you think that's feasible?
Yes, because what this Oxford study found, one of the most interesting things they found, was that a green stimulus delivers more in the short term as well as in the long term. And so a lot of the projects that we're talking about in terms of the green stimulus are what they call shovel ready. So you can start in on them very, very quickly,
Right.
and they create a lot of jobs. So these would be jobs in, for instance, doing things like insulating houses that are
Right.
poorly insulated at the moment to make them more energy efficient.
Right.
It would be things like fitting homes with solar panels so they could generate their own energy. It could be things in established industries, such as constructing wind farms or building the technology for wind farms. It could be diverting some of our existing industries, such as, for instance, the car manufacturing industry,
Right.
which in various areas has taken a hit. It could be directed at making electric cars in place of our gas guzzlers. So there are ways both to start green infrastructure projects that will have a lot of benefits straight away, and ways to stimulate existing industries in a green direction.
Now, specifically, do you think some of these, if in Parliament or in Congress stateside, if some of these proposals were put into were proposed, for lack of a better word, do you think that politicians would be okay voting for green specific stimulus? Because I don't think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we've seen very much of it since this whole thing started. But do you think that politically is that feasible?
Oh, very much so, because
Okay.
I think that if you can demonstrate the benefits to people, if you can say, well, there's a choice here, there are these old, dirty jobs that are in a troubled area of the economy, or there are these new green jobs that have all kinds of co-benefits, such as cleaner air and cleaner water and reducing climate change and all the rest of it. Um, we have we have a choice about whether we just go back to the old dirty way of doing things or whether we choose a cleaner future. And a cleaner future will generate more jobs now and will generate more jobs in the future and will generate more money for the public purse, as well as all these other benefits in terms of health. It seems like a pretty obvious choice to me. It's not that no one's being asked to make a sacrifice here, apart from some of the industries that are in dreadful trouble already, such as the oil industry, because the oil price has gone down.
Right.
Um, you know, what you need to do is to just reassure people that actually green jobs are permanent jobs. They're not just, it's not just a flash in the pan. If
Right.
you switch people from the old fossil fuel industries to working in new green energy industries, those are the jobs of the future, and they will continue to be there and continue to generate employment and generate investment and generate returns.
Totally. So I agree with all that, but I think you're a little bit more optimistic than me. In a country right now, I'm in the United States where EPA regulations and emission regulations have actually gone in the opposite direction. I'm yeah I'm we even before COVID-19, it's very difficult to pass some of the. I know the federal electric vehicle subsidy in the United States. I think that expired recently. So we're not even seeing for all the reasons you said why it's the smart move. We're not even seeing our government do that. So I'm wondering if I'm curious. Is it like that? Is it like that in the UK as well? Because maybe it's a little bit better over there than it is in the United States.
Well, yes. I mean, I think in the United States, unfortunately, President Trump is not very interested in anything that's green,
Right.
and that's unfortunate.
Not even green foods,
Because
not even salads.
sorry.
He doesn't even eat salad. Anything green, it's just meat and oil. That's what he does. So it was a joke. It's all good.
Yeah, but no, I think it's a joke with a lot of truth in it.
Right.
But it's unfortunate that he's taken that attitude, because it runs counter to what an awful lot of very smart and very well educated economists
Right.
would say, and it also runs counter to what an awful lot of industries and business people are saying, and it also runs counter to what an awful lot of state governments and local governments in
Right.
the United States are saying. And it runs counter to where a lot of the jobs are. It runs counter to a lot of people's actual experience of getting employment in new green jobs. And if they were given a bit of a boost, which is available to the president to offer, then there could be even more people in these green jobs. In Europe and in the United Kingdom, I think we are more willing to look at this, and we have an awful lot of industries, but they're everywhere. They're around the world. These industries that are able to present us with a future that really, if they were given the opportunity, if they were given the backing, the public money, and so on, that they really could create a new green economy. And we're already seeing signs of that.
Does Brexit, does the UK leaving the European Union, does that make it easier or more difficult for them to address climate change?
In theory, it shouldn't make any difference at all. In practice, I think the main difference is that it's a distraction. The energy that's going into Brexit
Right.
could have gone into greening the economy. We have a plan in the UK, and the government is committed to it, to be net zero emissions by 2050. That's a hard thing to do. It's going to require a lot of structural change to the economy, as well as some behavioral change. But it's possible. And our advisors, the people who advise the government, they have laid out the fact that it's possible and some of the ways in which we can do it. But the thing about it is, if you want to get there in 2050, you really need to start now. And so we really need our politicians to be very much focused on how to get to net zero as quickly as possible. And my only fear is that with Brexit, that if Brexit is your overriding concern, then everything else takes a back seat, and we really can't afford to let net zero take a back seat.
Right.
So we'll see. The COVID crisis is taking up everyone's attention at the moment. So all kinds of things have had to be delayed. I just hope that people are taking this opportunity to regroup and rethink and reset what the priorities are.
Right. Never let a crisis go to waste. So I want to ask you about carbon taxes. Do you think this is a viable way to address climate change?
There are several kinds of carbon tax, and yes, definitely, carbon taxes in various forms are a way to address climate change, but they're not the only way, and they have to be used carefully. And one of the forms of carbon tax that I think we should be looking at very carefully at the moment is the role of a carbon tax in trade, in international trade. Because you just talked about Brexit, and Brexit is all about trade.
Right.
And how the UK trades with other nations. The British government is at the moment in talks with the White House and the American government to try and get a trade deal. So, trade is on the table, and if international trade is on the table, then you've got to look at carbon taxes as part of that. Now, what we've seen in the United States, we've seen Mr. Trump has taken quite a protectionist stance in a lot of ways, and a lot of people are worried that there's going to be a trade war between the United States and China, if that's not already begun.
Right.
In some ways, it's not fully fledged yet, but its beginnings are certainly there. So in that context, you could look at countries, various countries around the world, could look at putting in a carbon tax at their borders, so that if you want to be allowed to export into a country, then you've got to show that your goods are low carbon. Otherwise, you will have to pay a tax at the border. And that could be a very effective weapon in terms of taking countries who are laggards in terms of dealing with climate change, because climate change is a global problem.
Right.
And if some countries are refusing to take up their responsibility, then using a border tax on carbon defensively could be a way of encouraging those laggard countries to keep up.
Right on. Now I want to ask with it, and this is how I found you. You recently, in a foreign affairs survey, you disagreed that nuclear energy should be a central piece of the fight against climate change, and you disagreed with a high degree of certainty. And I want to ask you why.
Well, I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with nuclear energy in some respects if it's done right, but the danger is that we get caught up in trying to put forward nuclear energy projects, trying to look to nuclear energy as some kind of savior, and it's not, and we don't have time to get this wrong. Nuclear energy projects in most places around the world, they take decades from start to fruition. If you look at the UK at the moment, we've got the first nuclear power station in, I think it's in about 30 years or more.
Right.
That new nuclear power station is supposed to be well underway by now. It's not. It's years behind schedule. It's going to be enormously expensive. It's going to be far, far more expensive than any other form of energy, and that's going to be paid for by the bill payer, the people who use the electricity. So it's years behind schedule. It's tens of billions of dollars over budget, and we still have no idea when it will actually be generating power. And that's just one nuclear power station. So there is no way that nuclear power is going to be the centerpiece
Right.
of the answer to climate change in the UK. We're seeing similar issues in a lot of other developed countries. In the United States, very difficult to imagine that you'll see a lot of new nuclear projects getting off the ground anytime soon. Similarly, in Japan, after the Fukushima disaster, similarly in Germany, where they've been closing down nuclear power plants, even in France, which is the kind of poster child
Right.
for nuclear energy. They're having problems with their new nuclear reactor that's under construction. Again, it's billions over budget and it's way behind schedule. Um, so in a lot of places around the world, nuclear energy is just going to be too slow. Because if you look at what the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is telling us, it's saying that we need to bring down emissions so fast. We really need to have turned that corner in the next decade and brought down emissions from a peak and start bringing them down, start halving emissions. We need to effectively get to net zero by 2050, which is only 30 years away. And 30 years, when you've taken, in the UK, you've just taken 10 years to get to the point where you're even beginning to clear the land and
Right.
pour the concrete for a nuclear reactor. We don't have enough time to wait to get nuclear on board. When you can put up a wind farm very quickly, when you can put up solar panels very quickly, when you can you can do lots of green activities like insulating houses, like building electric cars, like changing our infrastructure. All of that is much quicker than building new nuclear power plants. So it's not that I'm saying nuclear doesn't have a role. Clearly, in some regions, it does have a role. And clearly, it's important to keep what nuclear power we have at the moment, rather than replace it with something with fossil fuels like coal. But it's hard to see that nuclear is some kind of savior.
So then, do you think that it's wind and solar? Is that what's gonna be the are those the number two tech or the two technologies that are gonna help make our grid clean?
Yeah, because they're the cheapest.
Okay, so let me ask you this. One of the issues with wind and solar is that if the wind isn't blowing in certain, if the wind's not blowing, it's not generating energy, and also if the sun isn't shining, it's not generating energy. Whereas in a good thing about coal, or a good thing about natural gas, or these oil is that you can turn these things on, and you can effectively use them to increase or decrease output, really with just not the flip of a switch, but it's a lot easier to do that than with something like wind or solar. So do you think is it what can help address that gap that wind and solar have? Is it batteries? Is it let's charge up batteries that can then pump energy into the grid, or is it something else? Because I think it's generally considered that there is a gap there, that needs to still be addressed.
Batteries are useful, but the most important thing is to see the energy system in a holistic way. So just give one quick example. Building a lot of big batteries in one place would be quite hard. However, if you had a lot of electric vehicles, then they are effectively batteries. So if you had them, so for instance, you get more wind energy at night generally.
Right.
So if the electric cars were taking their energy at night, storing them in their battery, then you could use that energy during the day. Similarly, solar obviously only generates during the day, but what you can do is you can see your energy sources as part of a grid, rather than just seeing them as discrete. It's not just that your solar panels on your house power your house. And
Right.
that's not the only thing they do. What you need is those solar panels on your house to be feeding in to a grid, and that grid needs to encompass wind, solar, any other forms of renewable energy such as biomass and biogas, and balance them all out over a wide area. So batteries are important, but more important than that is grid technology to get everything connected in such a way that it's responsive and smart grid. Because if you think about it, the bigger your grid, the more likely it is that in some area of your grid, if it's big enough, the wind will be blowing. So you will be generating wind energy.
Right.
If your grid is big enough, again, there will be lots of areas of storage, so that when it's nighttime and the sun isn't shining, you've got that energy to give back, and it can be balanced across the grid. That's what's absolutely key, that you've got a holistic view of your energy system, and you've got the technology in place that you can balance that energy and take that energy across a whole vast grid. And at the moment, unfortunately, we haven't invested in our grids to that extent. We haven't put that smart technology in, but we can do.
So when you're saying vast grids, now you're talking about grids that are spanning continents, right? Because there's a lot of countries, solar and wind, it's just not viable. Like there's certain regions where the angle of the sun, it's not gonna generate the.
That's just nonsense.
So okay, so that's not true. So you're saying every country, besides maybe some extremes in the north and south, whatever, but every country can address their energy needs using solar as a solution?
No, I'm not saying that every country can generate all of their energy from solar. No, but I'm saying that there are very few problems with solar energy, and saying that it's not suitable in some regions is just not true. It's suitable, around the world. It can be used around the world. Similarly with wind, the wind blows around the world. And
right.
It blows, there's more wind in some areas than others.
Right, and I think that's my point.
Areas the UK has a lot of wind because,
right.
it's an island and geographically where it is. Similarly, you have some areas where it's easier to generate tidal energy, or if you had a decent project, you could do wave energy and so on. Some areas may not have that, but the sun shines, unless you're in Antarctica, when you don't get sun for quite a few months of the year, or
right.
at the very top of the world. But people tend not to live there.
Right.
In areas that don't have sun for 6 months of the year.
But certainly there's regions that are a lot more cloudy than others, right?
Yeah, there are regions that are cloudy, but you can generate solar energy on a cloudy day. You generate more energy. The sunnier it is, the more energy you generate. That's true.
Right.
But you can generate solar energy on solar panels on a cloudy day.
And you would posit that's enough to actually not address all energy needs, because as you said, you need a combination, but it's a substantial enough, even in regions where there's not as much sunlight as others, that it's a substantial enough solution that it's worth investing in.
In most areas of the world, you
right.
you can use solar power. In
right.
some areas, it'll be much easier than others.
Right.
But in most areas of the world, you can use wind as well. It's not about just trying for one solution.
Right.
All the way around the world. You need a combination of things. You need solar, you need wind, you need to bring in these other energies if you've got them. Why wouldn't you use tidal if you've got it? Why wouldn't you use hydroelectricity if it's feasible?
Right.
It's not always feasible, and sometimes it can be ecologically harmful, so you've got to be really careful with hydro. But that you don't need a blanket ban on it. In some areas it is quite feasible.
Totally.
And you have other sources like biogas, and generating electricity from waste and so on. In some areas, biomass can be quite a useful source. So you've got a suite of different technologies that can be used around the world. It's not like you're just saying, okay, over here you can only have solar, over there you can only have wind. Oh, hey, look, it doesn't work. It's not like that.
Right, right. I'd be curious. Do you recommend any sources for looking? Because based on things I've read, I think it would differ a little bit than with what you're saying. But I'm very curious about some of the sources that you like. Maybe it's in the that inter governmental panel. Do they have? Is there some assessment on, okay, these regions are better for these types of energy generating things like solar or wind? Or do you have anything like that, or recommend a kind of direction to look at for information like that? Because I think you're making great points, and I'd love to dive more into that.
There's an organization called the International Energy Agency.
Perfect.
That produces a World Energy Outlook every year. That's got basically, it's a kind of Bible in terms of energy statistics. There's the International Renewable Energy Association. There's the World Energy Council. There's a lot of organizations that produce data in different forms that could probably help you with that.
Perfect. We'll definitely link to those in the show notes. So as we and I really appreciate your time here, as we kind of wrap things up, is there some, as a journalist who you've made your livelihood covering the environment, and that's what you've gone all in on. I'm curious if there's things that you look at in public discourse or even around the dinner table that you think people, some single major thing that you wish more people understood about the things that you write about climate change? Are there things that that is a lot of people are being misguided by? Is there something that's out there that you kind of just like, I wish everyone understood this one thing, because people don't seem to get it?
I think what people don't understand is the urgency of this and the fact that
right,
it's going to happen whether we want it to or not, really. That it doesn't matter what attitude we take. It doesn't matter whether we who we vote for or what we believe in. The fact is that the more we put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the more we will change the world's climate.
right,
And that is a simple physical fact. It's physics and chemistry, and it's immutable.
right,
And that's just going to happen, whatever we do. So what we need to do is to stop doing the thing that we know is changing the
right.
climate if we don't want to have a disaster. And I think there's a lot of people who sort of haven't really grasped the fact that this is real. This isn't something that you can argue over. You can't change the laws of physics.
Right.
So we better just get on and deal with the things that we can change.
Right, right. One more question that just popped in my head, because I think a lot of the solutions that that we've talked about the past half hour is on the kind of the government, kind of the industrial level. What would you recommend to individuals that want to that want to make a little bit of difference in this fight of climate change? What is something that you tell people? If you do this thing, that's gonna help lower emissions. Is there something you tell people how they can help in the fight?
I think that's going to differ for every individual, really, because I think that some people are in a position where maybe they could, maybe they're finding in the COVID crisis that they could work from home,
right?
Totally. So they don't need to be generating all those emissions from commuting. Maybe some people are finding that they could cycle instead of driving a car, or maybe people are finding things in their individual lives at the moment. But the thing is that we can't change this as individuals. We can make a difference as individuals, but we can't make the huge amount of difference that's needed just by changing our own behavior. We need to change the systems. So we need to change how we generate energy, and what we do with our energy. We need to change how we uh, how we produce food, and what we do with the food that we produce. There are lots of different things that need to happen at a very big scale, not just at the scale of what I do in my life. And I think we need to recognize that and give our leaders the signal that we actually want a livable world, and not a world that we have destroyed by continuing to generate too much carbon dioxide.
Right. So vote sounds like might be a good solution. Okay, Fiona. This is everyone. Fiona Harvey. Fiona, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate you sharing with us, and keep doing your thing. We talk about what individuals can do, and you're writing a lot of. You're a very prolific writer on this stuff, and just keep doing your thing, because you're moving the needle. I've certainly read your stuff, and I appreciate you coming on and sharing your beliefs. And I'm hopefully we can talk in 30 years and say, wow, we actually ended up solving this whole thing, but maybe not. But we'll see. Okay, Fiona, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.